Hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar from the Queensland Government Centre of Excellence for Clinical Innovation and Behaviour Support, presented by myself, Keith Smith, and my colleague Kate Brackley from Bild, the British Institute of Learning Disabilities. This webinar is called Providing a Voice for the Voiceless, an Introduction to Non-Instructed Advocacy. And can I remind you that you can submit questions at any point during the presentation using the text entry box below the slide screen. So please do send us any questions you may have. In terms of what we're hoping to achieve over the next hour, this webinar will actually provide a context about advocacy and advocacy values that will help you to understand how those underpin the practice of non-instructed advocacy. It will provide an overview of the different types of advocacy and will also very clearly explain what is non-instructed advocacy. And in terms of approaches to working in this way, we'll offer a toolbox of approaches and also identify the potential challenges that you need to consider when pursuing this course of action. So what is advocacy, and why is this term often so confusing and misunderstood? Let's be very clear. Advocacy is when a person helps you to be heard. It's about helping you express your views and concerns, to explore your choices, to access information and services, and really importantly, to protect and promote your rights. An advocate is independent and there to represent you. Annie Lawton has said that an advocate stands beside the person and focuses on seeing things from their perspective, which I think is a really helpful comment. And it's really important to recognise the power imbalance between the vulnerable person and services and supports and decision makers that advocacy really challenges. And in terms of advocacy and where does it fit in services and the framework of supports in any local area, advocacy is seen as an essential component of local services and supports, particularly for people who are at risk of exclusion from our society. And when one thinks of the sorts of individuals for whom non-instructed advocacy works, we're looking at the most vulnerable. We're looking at those with the highest support needs. We're looking at people who cannot communicate with words and therefore cannot actually tell you what choices and decisions they actually want. So that's really important. And what is advocacy? I really like this definition because it seems to summarise it in a few sentences. So it's about taking action to help people say what they want, secure their rights, represent their interests and obtain services they need. And advocates and advocacy schemes work in partnership with the people they support and take their side. This isn't about being unbiased, it isn't about being including all views. The advocate is actually on the side of the person with disabilities. And advocacy promotes social inclusion, equality and social justice. So what does advocacy actually do? What's the nitty-gritty? It's about helping and supporting individuals to get information, because information is power. And much of the information that's around about health and social care actually isn't accessible. And people with learning disabilities actually need support to get the information and to understand it. Advocacy is about understanding people's rights. It's about helping people make their own choices, based on the information that they're provided and to voice their own views and opinions. And advocacy is clearly independent from services. The lack of a conflict of interest is really important. You cannot have an advocate who's actually paid by the services that they are actually working with. That independence is really, really important. Advocacy is also about not just giving people a voice, but making sure that they're heard and that they're answered, that change happens as a result of the advocacy support. It's also about enabling people to have more control over their lives. So they're not being told what to do, and they're not given just the options that people think would be good for them. It's very much about providing much more choice and control and working for equal rights and inclusion. I think it's also really important to know what advocacy isn't. And actually, it isn't about mediation, counselling or befriending. It's so much more than that. Advocacy isn't about giving advice. An advocate will actually give the information and talk about what's available, but really support people to make their own decisions. I've already said it's not unbiased. In fact, advocacy is the most biased way of working, because at the end of the day, it's about supporting your advocacy partner. It's not about telling someone what to do. It's about supporting a person with learning disabilities to actually make their own decisions. It's not about creating barriers with family or service providers. I think it's fair to say that sometimes poor advocacy only actually alienates families and service providers. That's not particularly helpful. There are ways to challenge and work in partnership with families and service providers to make sure that the advocacy partner achieves exactly what they want. And I think it's really important for advocacy to take time, particularly with families, to actually work in partnership with them and to make sure that they work together in terms of supporting people's choices and options. And advocacy isn't about filling any gaps in services. I think one of the most confusing things about advocacy is that there are a number of different models, all of which come under the label of advocacy, but which will actually do different things depending on the type of work undertaken and the length of time that the advocate is involved and the way in which they work. We're just going to have a look at some of those models of advocacy. So independent and professional advocacy is a partnership between a paid advocate and an advocacy partner. The advocate and partner negotiate what advocacy work will be required, with the advocate providing information, support and representation. The aim is to empower their partner and enable them to express their preferences, needs and choices. The length of time that the advocate is involved will depend on the complexity of the issues to be addressed. So this could be short or long term, and often it's labelled different ways, so it could include crisis advocacy, case advocacy, or issues-based advocacy. Peer advocacy is speaking up for someone with a similar background or a shared experience, often of service provision, coming on an individual or a group basis and focuses on common problem solving. Volunteer citizen advocacy involves unpaid volunteers being recruited, trained and matched with a partner. This focuses on the development of a long-term relationship, and citizen advocates are encouraged to use their own networks to strengthen their partner's social networks. A citizen advocate will use their knowledge of their partner to represent their views if necessary, but the key part of the citizen advocacy partnership is that relationship, a long-term relationship, someone being alongside them for a long time, and in particular, citizen advocacy is successful when it works with individuals with high support needs who overall probably don't have a lot of friends or a lot of other significant others in their life, and not having people to actually stand by them and speak up for them. And self-advocacy is where individuals represent and speak up for themselves with support. This can be as individuals or collectively as part of self-advocacy groups or organisations. And as part of self-advocacy, I think it's fair to say that the focus is on developing the confidence, skills and knowledge of the self-advocates. So I'm now going to pass you on to my colleague, Kate Brackley, who's going to talk about what does advocacy mean to me.
Advocacy means to be able to speak up for yourself, and also for people with learning disabilities to be able to challenge and break down the barriers that affect our lives so we can be the same as everyone else and to be included in the community. We also stand up for our rights and campaign on things that matter to us. For example, benefits, transport, hate crime, mate crime, keeping safe online and in our communities. We have to have support to lead an ordinary life. This is vital to us as we want to be included in the community and have our voices heard. How has advocacy helped me? My mum set up an advocacy organisation for people with learning disabilities in Droitwich called Speak Easy Now. Me and my mum talked about self-advocacy and what it meant and how this would change my life. I did a lot with my mum through Speak Easy Now and became a full-time member. I also signed up to a self-advocacy group called Our Way Self-Advocacy. This has really changed my life incredibly. It made a lot of difference to me and my life. Through self-advocacy, I was able to make my own choices and decisions by myself. Self-advocacy and me. Self-advocacy has given me the confidence to achieve so much in my life. This has included getting involved in my local theatre and having a full and hectic social life. I have a full-time job at Bild and get paid for it. Through my job, I travel to Australia, working for a week in Brisbane, and then a 3-week backpacking holiday. I have been on a television series called The Indatables, and this gave me the opportunity to attend a film premiere. I have founded 2 advocacy groups in Droitwich and Worcester. I have had the opportunity to get involved in a national group called People First London. I am part of their management committee and I am now the membership officer, which I love doing a lot. It gives me a chance to see what members they have got and to issue them with membership hats and a unique membership card. I also attend an advisory group through my work called Build for the Future. I am also a member of Worcestershire's People's Parliament. Through all of these examples of self-advocacy groups detailed above, I cannot believe that I have come this far. Self-advocacy is so important in my life. It has made me feel more confident and a better person than I am today. I am now going to hand you back to Keith Smith.
So what is the impact of advocacy? Interestingly, in terms of research, there's very little structured research about the impact of advocacy on advocacy partners. And much of the feedback is based upon qualitative reports from people's experiences, their feelings, their stories of how advocacy has helped them. But overall, there's clear agreement that actually advocacy increases people's confidence and self-esteem, and as a direct result of that, provides increased choice and control. But advocacy partners feel safer and more secure, that they have improved health and well-being, reduced mental distress, and probably the most important is a more positive self-identity. What comes across is very much that with the rise in confidence and the belief that having an advocacy partner and an advocate supporting actually gives people that belief in themselves. And certainly my experience is that I have seen people grow enormously as individuals, from shy people with very little to say for themselves to people who are very much leading the lights in their local self-advocacy organisations. And having presented an overview about advocacy in general, the values, what it is and what it achieves, we're now going to focus on non-instructed advocacy and answer the question, what is the best way to protect the partner's rights through non-instructed advocacy? And so I'm going to pass you back to Kate in terms of answering what non-instructed advocacy means to her.
Non-instructed advocacy is about people that find it difficult to speak for themselves and therefore have to communicate through eye contact, facial expressions, body language, or by touch and feel, and using communication aids to enable them to have a voice. For example, a talking computer, a rattle, review music, or by using sensory rooms to be able to express what they are trying to say to someone. Families and family carers have a vital role to play here, as they are the ones that know what their son or daughter is like, and they want the best for them as well. I'm now going to put you back on to Keith Smith.
So what is this thing called non-instructed advocacy? The definition that's on the screen is a really good definition. So it's non-instructed advocacy is taking affirmative action with or on behalf of a person who's unable to instruct an advocate due to issues of capacity, comprehension, and or communication. And it again goes on to say, what in fact does the non-instructed advocate then do? And it says it seeks to uphold the person's right, ensure fair and equal treatment and access to services, and to make certain that decisions are taken with due consideration for all relevant factors, which include the person's unique preferences and perspectives. So you can see that very much the values of advocacy underpin this approach. But is it advocacy? The use of non-instructed advocacy is sometimes seen as controversial because advocacy is based very clearly on the advocate working to the instruction of their advocacy partner. Well, if someone can't provide that instruction, how can the advocate represent something that doesn't exist? And there are some advocacy organisations that will not actually offer non-instructed advocacy with a stance that says, actually, this isn't advocacy. But if that's the case, if people walk away from supporting those who are literally voiceless, is that not simply denying them a voice? And I would argue that actually non-instructed advocacy is really important because it's actually supporting those who are most vulnerable. And that then leads to these additional questions. Who will make the decisions on behalf of the person? Is it their family? Is it the staff working for the services that support them? Is it health or social care professionals? And where is the accountability in that? And really, what's the best way of doing this thing called non-instructed advocacy and protecting people's rights? The challenge of getting it right. At the heart of advocacy is a commitment to safeguarding the rights of the most vulnerable, and non-instructed advocacy is a practical manifestation of that commitment. The challenge is to develop the skills and confidence of advocates to work in this way and to raise awareness amongst others of the legitimacy of this approach. It's really important that actually advocates working in this way are supported and that their skills, knowledge and experience are developed, because it is working in a significantly different way to other advocacy options. So what does a non-instructed advocate do? They get to know their advocacy partner. They work out their preferred ways of communication. They find out what others know. And when we talk about others, we're talking about family carers, friends, those people who know them well. And it's about upholding their rights. And to some extent, the rest of this webinar is going to be looking at how, at different approaches that actually support that way of working. So I'm going to pass you back to Kate, who's going to tell us how to find out what a person wants if they can't use words.
I will talk to the family that loves and cares for them the most and get a bigger picture of her son's daughter's life is like. I would then talk to the person and work out through any communication aid what they are trying to say, and I would take my time to listen, using eye contact and other appropriate ways to use. I would follow this up by learning what support is needed. If they have a support worker around them, then I would talk to them as well, so I can capture everything and create a picture, and I would draw up a document that is fully understandable and easy to read, so everyone can understand what I have learned from this. my friend James. I came into contact with somebody called James, who previously lived with his mum in Kidderminster. James is somebody in a wheelchair with multiple needs. I was in town and met James and his support worker. I said hello and he waved his rattle and blinked his eyes, and I could tell he wanted to say hello back to me, but he could not speak. I took the hint through his eyes that he said hello to me. After a while, I took an interest in James, as on Sundays he would come out to listen to the band in the park in the summer. I could tell he was enjoying himself. He was happy and he was shaking his rattle. He was laughing and was trying to dance with his support worker. However, I've also seen James being sad. He was quiet and non-responsive and was not at his best. I'm now going to hand you back to Keith Smith.
Thank you, Kate. During the development of thinking around non-instructed advocacy, people very much argued that a particular approach would be better and more useful than others. I think what's happened over time is that people have wanted to use a much more holistic approach, a much more mix and match depending upon the particular advocacy partner, their needs, and the ways in which that support could be offered. David Petoniak is an American psychologist, and I find what he says about having a toolbox of approaches really helpful. The toolboxes, if they're any good at all, are full of stuff you need, organised so that you can find what you want when you need it. Pick and use each tool carefully. A good tool always depends on the skill and intention of its master. So we're going to be looking at some of the tools, some of the approaches that advocates can use in relation to non-instructed advocacy. Fundamental and underpinning all of this is the issue around communication. Every person has their unique ways of communicating, and in terms of actually learning about the person, it's important to spend time with them. I think it's also important to recognise that actually someone may not be communicating because they're choosing not to communicate. And that's actually giving you evidence of what they think in a really clear way. In terms of finding out about the communication, it's really important to ask those who know them best. Families often feel that they're excluded by professionals in terms of involvement in their sons' and daughters' lives, particularly once they've left school and become young adults. A skilled advocate will make sure that they actually ask the right questions and learn how their advocacy partner communicates and the history of that communication over the years. It's important, if speech and language therapists have been involved or are still involved, to actually work alongside them in terms of identifying the communication, and also in terms of total communication approaches, which at the end of the day means whatever works for an advocacy partner in relation to communication, that's what should be being used. And in terms of what approach, really it's anything and everything, because each person is unique and each person will have their own ways of communicating. So it's very much about looking at issues of body language, facial expressions, gestures, sounds and signs. Having a look at additional resources that actually the person has used, such as photos, pictures, symbols, objects of reference. Some people now have multimedia profiles. Many individuals have communication passports, which actually identify very clearly their chosen and preferred communication method. It may be that intensive interaction is something that will work, and also lots of people have a range of communication aids which can vary from simple switches to actually quite complex technological machines. And even starting at a basic level, it's just really important that in relation to an advocacy partner, an advocate can understand how they show their emotions and feelings. You know, what do they do when they're feeling happy, sad, excited, angry, anxious, lonely, tired, unwell, worried, pleased? And these can actually be built into a grid which gives a really good starting point from which communication can start to develop and preferences can be discovered. In terms of person-centred approaches, I would like to think that that actually underpins all of the work that advocates actually carry out. But it's really important that in relation to someone who can't communicate with words, that actually the advocate can spend time to get to know the advocacy partner, that they can build a trusted relationship, and that this is about building a full picture of their partner. This is about asking the question, what makes life more meaningful for the advocacy partner? And it's about involving as many other people who know and care about the partner as possible, and not relying just on a single person's view. An advocate needs to know and understand as much as possible about their advocacy partner, so that in situations where the partner can't indicate a clear preference, the advocate can suggest what this might be based on their knowledge. And the advocate's knowledge will be able to be much more rich by involving as many other people as possible who know and care about the advocacy partner, rather than relying on a single person's views. In all of this, the independence of the advocate is really important. There should not be any conflict of interest. They are there to support their advocacy partner. A second approach in terms of non-instructed advocacy is very much about being rights-based. Human rights are our basic freedoms, and make sure that all people are treated with dignity, respect, treated fairly, and listened to and have a say over their lives. And this approach means that the advocate focuses on making sure that basic human rights are actually promoted and defended, and asks the questions, are their partner's civil, human and welfare rights being respected, and are they being treated fairly and without discrimination? It's about identifying the issues that need to be addressed. This could include poor practice and abuse, and this approach is helpful in crisis situations where an advocate is called in to actually have a look and make a judgment around what's happening to an advocacy partner. Often there's a need to act quickly with little time to get to know the partner. And the key thing is that the advocate knows about those rights legislation, and also the legislation about standards of quality of life, so that they can actually measure between the legislation or the standards and what's happening in a person's life. And clearly, if we were looking in terms of Queensland, the sorts of areas that you'd expect an advocate to know would be very much about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Disability Discrimination Act, the National Standards of Disability Services, and Queensland Government's own Disability Services Act and Human Services Quality Framework. It's important that the advocate can ask the question about how these are actually being implemented. It may well be that the advocate would not necessarily be looking to take any sort of legal proceedings, but having the knowledge to actually use this legislation in terms of the United Nations. You know, if you look at Article 10, right to life, then it's important that in terms of health decisions that are being made, particularly around issues like the use of do not resuscitate, that actually being able to say this does not fit in with Article 10 right to life may well be enough to actually introduce that challenge into the professional discussions that are taking place. The watching brief is a very clear process that has actually been developed by an advocacy organisation called ASSIST, which stands for Advocacy Services in Staffordshire in the UK, and was developed really to give a more objective way of supporting advocacy partners who aren't able to communicate. It's a process by which an advocate develops questions on behalf of their advocacy partner, so that if any change in their life is suggested, the advocate looks at how it will have an impact on the life of the advocacy partner. And the questions are developed from the 8 domains to a quality life. And the advocate asks questions relevant to those domains affected by the proposal, and the questions will be developed from the advocate's knowledge of their partner. ASSIST have developed a very clear framework, and full details are actually available on their website. But what this does do is provide a really objective way in which the 8 domains are actually assessed in terms of their impact. And those 8 domains look at areas such as skills and abilities, community presence, continuity, choice and influence, individuality, status and respect, and partnerships and relationships and well-being. And the fundamental question that the watching brief raises is, what's in it for my advocacy partner in relation to any proposed change or any proposed decision or choice? And the final approach that we're going to discuss this morning is witness observer. And this is where the advocate spends time observing their partner in different settings and at different times. And they're looking at how they're treated, how they interact with other people, how they get on with their family, how they get on with service providers. And the key thing about this is it's something that doesn't actually require a relationship to have been developed between the advocate and the partner. And if something unacceptable or needs addressing is identified, then the advocate can take action. This approach is really effective in terms of preventing abuse and neglect. Now, as we've been talking, it's very clear that the skills, knowledge and experience needed by the advocates to actually really support and work well using non-instructed advocacy actually need to be developed, and the advocates actually need support and supervision. So looking at some of those practical issues in terms of supporting advocates, I would say very clearly that they need regular one-to-one casework supervision, and this is particularly looking at making sure that the advocate is not using their views or opinions to influence their work with their advocacy partner. Always good to have group support and networking with other advocates. We'd expect an annual appraisal, and we'd expect ongoing training and personal development opportunities. And in terms of time to actually receive that support, we'd also look for opportunity for reflection and analysis of own practice, and best practice in evidence gathering and record keeping. At the end of the day, in order to justify the way the preferences and choices and opinions that the advocate are suggesting, they need to be able to provide the evidence that very clearly legitimises their opinions. And that's actually how that gathering of evidence and keeping those records is a really important part of this approach. We hope that we've been able to stimulate your thinking, and that what we've said has been helpful in providing an introduction to non-instructed advocacy. Thank you for listening, and we have produced a practice guide to non-instructed advocacy, which is available to download from Bild on the address that is on the screen. There we go. Any questions? And we've got lots of questions. So we'll start off, when someone isn't able to communicate, how do you ensure that you're not imposing your views or wants on the person? I think there are a number of ways in which you can address this, but the two most important are making sure that you speak to as many different people who know the individual and the advocacy partner, and that you record that evidence. So, as we were just been saying, there's actually legitimacy, and it can, the reasons for suggesting particular courses of action can actually be accepted. Alongside that is also making sure that the advocate receives casework supervision, an important part of which will be the line manager or supervisor actually offering that challenge in terms of how are you working in a way that doesn't impose your views and opinions. How can you support someone who's had a bad advocacy experience? I think it's about building a trusted relationship with a person. I would expect an advocate to have the skills and be able to develop relationship which is positive. I think there would be the need to actually understand what's happened previously, what made that a bad advocacy relationship, and reassure the advocacy partner that that would not be repeated in any way. And we have a question which said, what 2 pieces of advice would Kate offer to someone who wants to develop their self-advocacy skills? I'll just pass you to Kate. Okay. Kate's saying that she doesn't feel confident to actually answer that question. So we'll move on to, I've worked with people who don't have a functional communication system and who have support workers who've worked with them for many years. While this can be fantastic, I've also found it difficult at times when support workers say, I know the person really well, I know what they want. Do you have any suggestions about what to do in this situation? I think that's not a unique situation. I think I've heard that from both support workers and from families. I think it's really important that the function and the way in which advocacy works is shared with them, and there's an opportunity to talk that through. Because again, I think there's a lot of confusion. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what advocacy does. And I think people feel very defensive that someone like an advocate is going to come in and criticise them. I think there's a need to actually almost work in partnership with support workers and with families, but at the same time to maintain that unique advocacy independent perspective. I don't think it's easy, because it is overcoming what may well be both defensive nature, but also people, if they've been supporting people for a long, long time, will almost inevitably feel that they've got it right and the right support. And I think there is an issue about someone coming in with fresh eyes who can actually look at that. Just looking at some of the other questions. So are there any tools or resources that you would suggest are useful when working with individuals who do not communicate, such as communication passports? I think there are a range of tools, and to some extent that's almost a challenge, because whether it be the use of communication passports or communication aids, or things like using talking maps or big maps, there's a whole range of different stuff. I think it's really important to be to work with people who know the advocacy partner well, and work out what would be the most helpful way of actually identifying ways in which information about how they communicate is actually written down, recorded, what's going to be the most useful way. I think also, I think clearly, if you're someone that doesn't know that much about communication, actually linking into the local speech and language therapy people is really important, because I think it's an ever-changing field, and I think the things like multimedia profiling coming in actually make it really helpful, if a little confusing in terms of potentially the lack of information. do you think that everyone will benefit from an instructed advocacy approach? Good question. Yes, I think I do. I think there's no one approach that will actually meet the needs of everybody, and I think it's an approach which needs to be underpinned, particularly by working in person-centred ways. I suppose the alternative is doing nothing, and that doesn't feel to me to be appropriate or helpful. The concept of non-instructed advocacy is new to me. You mentioned that advocates need to develop their skills and knowledge to work in this way. Do you have any suggestion of useful resources, especially if I'm not aware of any training I can attend? I think that some of the references that we've put on the webinar can be helpful. There's a particular book which surprisingly is produced by Bild, by Annie Lawton, which has a sort of toolbox of approaches, particularly focusing on non-instructed advocacy. That for me would be a good starting point. I think the reality is there isn't much material out there. This is these approaches are new, and we would recognise in this webinar that all we're offering is an introduction. But I would start with Annie Lawton's resource, which you can get on the Bild website. Okay, I'm just going to pass you on to my. Would you please provide the link to the online resource again? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Peter. I work for Bild as well. We've created a page on the Bild website, which you can access, which will give you a link to watch this webinar again. That link will be live in 2 to 3 days' time. But you can also download the practice guide that Keith mentioned earlier. And the link address for that page is the 3ws.bild, bild.org.uk/, and this is all one word, all lowercase, Queensland webinar. Everyone who's registered for this webinar will be sent an email in 2 or 3 days' time, which will also give you a link to watch whenever you choose. And I'll pass you back to Keith. Thank you.
Okay, that's the end of our webinar. I say thank you to Kate and to Peter, who's been offering us our sort of technical support from Bild here. And I hope that you feel that you've had a good webinar and that you now understand the non-instructed advocacy approach. Thank you.